I never imagined the day I'd finally get everything I ever wanted would also be the day I discovered the man who destroyed my family had been sitting 3 feet away from me at every holiday dinner for the past 11 years, smiling, passing the gravy, calling me brother, in that easy voice that never once cracked. And I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this, which is that betrayal doesn't always announce itself with shouting or slammed doors. Sometimes, it just sits at your table for over a decade, eating your mother's cooking, learning your habits, waiting for exactly the right moment to finish what it started years before you even knew it had begun. And my name is Desmond Okafor, and this is the story of how I found out the quiet, careful, endlessly patient man who married my sister was the same person who put my father in an early grave, stole the family construction business out from under us through forged paperwork. Nobody bothered to double check because grief makes people careless, and spent 11 years pretending to grieve alongside us while quietly making sure none of us ever had the resources or the standing to figure out what he'd done. And it started as these things always seem to, with something small and completely unremarkable, a misplaced folder in my mother's attic that I only found because she'd asked me to help clear out boxes for a hip replacement she was recovering from. Boxes filled with dust and old photographs, and my father's handwriting on invoices from a business that used to be the pride of our entire family before it slipped away from us in the 18 months following his sudden death from what everyone always called a heart attack. And I want to be honest with you, I never once questioned that explanation. My father was 61, overweight, worked 60-hour weeks his entire adult life. A heart attack made perfect tragic sense, and grief, real grief, doesn't leave much room for suspicion. It just leaves a hole shaped exactly like the person you lost. And I spent most of my 20s simply trying to survive around the edges of that hole, rather than examine it too closely, working an ordinary job in logistics, keeping a respectful distance from a family business that had, by the time I was old enough to really understand what happened, already passed entirely out of our hands and into the control of my sister's husband, a soft-spoken, meticulous man named Tobias Renner, who had married my sister Chiamaka only 4 months before our father's death. A timeline I never once thought to interrogate because why would I grief doesn't leave room for math, and Tobias had, in the aftermath of my father's death, presented himself as the only stable, capable adult left standing, gently, patiently taking over the paperwork. Nobody else had the stomach to touch gently. Patiently explaining to my devastated mother that the business had more debt than any of us realized. Gently, patiently guiding the entire family toward selling controlling shares to cover that debt, shares that, through a structure none of us fully understood at the time, ended up concentrated almost entirely under his name within 18 months of my father's funeral. And for 11 years, I genuinely believed this was simply what tragedy looked like. A family losing its foundation and doing its best, however imperfectly, to survive the wreckage. And then I opened a dusty folder in my mother's attic labeled simply D. Okafor Personal 2013. In my father's own careful handwriting, and inside it tucked behind old tax documents nobody had touched in over a decade, I found a letter my father had written but apparently never sent, dated exactly 9 days before his death, addressed to a lawyer whose name I didn't recognize, and the letter written in the same steady hand I remembered signing my school report cards described in careful, methodical detail. My father's growing suspicion that his new son-in-law had been quietly siphoning money out of the company's supplier accounts for months, funneling it through shell vendors that didn't actually exist. And my father wrote that he intended to confront Tobias directly within the week, that he'd already hired an independent forensic accountant to review the books, and that if his suspicions proved correct, he had every intention of having the marriage to Chiamaka annulled on grounds of fraud before it went any further, and I sat on the dusty attic floor holding that letter for what felt like an hour. The afternoon light slanting gold through a small window, my hands actually shaking because 9 days is an unbearably short amount of time. 9 days between writing that letter and dying of what everyone called a natural heart attack. And some cold, clarifying part of my brain that I didn't recognize in myself immediately began doing arithmetic. I desperately wished I could ignore. And I want you to understand that I didn't leap immediately to the most horrifying possible conclusion. I am not a man built for dramatic leaps. I spent the next several weeks doing what I do best, quietly, methodically gathering information, starting with the independent forensic accountant my father mentioned in that letter, a woman named Priscilla Adeyemi, who it turned out was still very much alive and still very much in practice. And when I finally worked up the courage to call her office and explain who I was, there was a long silence on the other end of the line before she asked if I could come in person because she said this wasn't a conversation she wanted to have over the phone, and sitting across from her in a small, cluttered office 3 weeks later, she told me something that rearranged the entire architecture of my understanding of my own family's history. She told me that my father had in fact hired her, that she had in fact completed a preliminary review of the company's supplier accounts before his death, and that she had found exactly what he suspected, a pattern of payments to at least 4 vendor accounts that, upon closer inspection, existed only on paper. Money bleeding out of the company at a rate of roughly $40,000 a month for nearly a year before my father's death, all of it eventually routing back through several careful intermediary steps to accounts controlled by Tobias Renner, and she told me she had tried in the immediate aftermath of my father's death to reach my family with her findings, but that her calls went unanswered, her emails ignored, and eventually grieving. Confused, assuming the family had simply moved on or hired other counsel, she'd let the matter drop, filing her report away in a drawer where it sat forgotten for 11 years, waiting for someone like me to finally come looking. And I asked her, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be, whether her report said anything about how my father actually died. And she looked at me for a long moment before saying carefully that she wasn't a medical examiner, that she couldn't speak to that, but that she found it deeply strange, professionally strange, that a man who had just discovered he was being systematically defrauded by his own son-in-law, a man actively preparing to confront that son-in-law and potentially destroy his marriage to protect the family business, would die of a sudden, unexplained heart attack 9 days later with no prior cardiac history in his medical records. And I left her office that afternoon and sat in my car in the parking lot for nearly 40 minutes without starting the engine. Because the version of my life I'd been living for 11 years, the version where my father died tragically but naturally, where Tobias was simply a competent, steady presence who'd helped the family survive an unbearable loss, that version was cracking apart in real time. And underneath it was something so much darker, I genuinely didn't know if I had the stomach to look directly at it. But I did, because some things, once you glimpse them, cannot be unseen, and the next several months of my life became consumed by a quiet, obsessive, carefully hidden investigation that I told no one about, not my mother, whose health was fragile enough that I genuinely feared what this information might do to her, not my sister Chiamaka, who I now had to consider might either be a willing participant in whatever happened 11 years ago and this possibility haunted me more than the alternative. An unknowing victim who had spent over a decade married to the man who killed her own father, and certainly not Tobias himself, who continued throughout all of this to show up at every family gathering with the same warm, unbothered smile, the same careful attentiveness toward my mother that had for 11 years made him seem like the family's quiet savior rather than its architect of ruin. And I began slowly, carefully rebuilding the financial trail Priscilla Adeyemi had started hiring through a friend from my logistics job, who moonlighted in corporate investigations, a forensic researcher who specialized in exactly this kind of long-buried financial archaeology. A sharp, no-nonsense woman named Farah Kelso, who took one look at the initial documents I'd gathered and told me bluntly that this was going to take money, patience, and an enormous amount of caution. Because if Tobias had successfully hidden a murder for 11 years, and she used that word deliberately carefully watching my face when she said it, then he was either extraordinarily lucky or extraordinarily careful. And careful men noticed when someone started asking questions, and over the following 8 months working almost entirely on evenings and weekends around my regular job, funding the investigation with savings I'd been building for a house I now realized I might never buy, Farah and I slowly reconstructed a financial and personal history that painted a portrait of Tobias Renner far more calculated and far colder than the warm family man I'd known for over a decade. We learned that Tobias hadn't simply married into our family out of love, though I want to be fair here even now. Even now, even knowing everything I eventually learned, I still believe some part of what he felt for my sister was genuine. Human beings are rarely simple enough to be entirely one thing, but the timing was the part that gutted me most. Because Farah's research uncovered that Tobias had been quietly, deliberately courting a position within my father's construction company for nearly 2 years before he ever started dating Chiamaka, applying for a project management role, getting rejected. Applying again under a slightly different resume, getting rejected again. My father, it turned out, had specific and well-documented concerns about Tobias's professional history. A previous employer who had quietly let him go under circumstances that, when Farah finally tracked down a retired HR manager willing to talk off the record, involved suspected but never proven expense account manipulation, and my father, cautious by nature, had simply never hired him, and then 11 years ago. Tobias met Chiamaka at a mutual friend's engagement party, and within 4 months they were married, a whirlwind romance that at the time everyone in the family attributed to simple, uncomplicated love, and I remember sitting with this new information, feeling something close to nausea because I could suddenly see the entire shape of a plan I'd spent 11 years completely blind to, a man rejected from the front door who simply found a side entrance instead, marrying his way into access he couldn't earn professionally. And once inside, once trusted, once treated as family, slowly, patiently building the financial infrastructure to drain the company from within. And when my father finally noticed, when my father finally hired Priscilla Adeyemi and started asking the exact right questions, Tobias's carefully constructed access, his marriage, his position, his entire elaborate side entrance into a life and a fortune he could never have earned honestly. All of it was suddenly urgently at risk, and I sat with Farah in her cramped office looking at a timeline stretched across a whiteboard, a timeline that made the shape of a motive horrifyingly, undeniably clear. And I asked her the question that had been sitting like a stone in my chest for months, whether she thought it was possible, actually possible, that Tobias had done something to cause my father's death directly, rather than simply benefiting from a genuine tragedy. And Farah, who I'd come to respect for her refusal to speculate beyond what evidence actually supported, was quiet for a long moment before telling me that financial forensics could prove motive and opportunity with tremendous precision, but that proving the actual mechanism of death 11 years after the fact, with a body long buried and no contemporary suspicion ever raised, was an entirely different and much harder problem, one that might honestly never be fully solvable. And she asked me directly what I actually wanted out of all this. Revenge, closure, or justice. Because she said those three things sometimes overlapped and sometimes didn't, and I needed to know which one I was actually chasing before I went any further, because the further we went, the more expensive and dangerous this became. And I told her, and I meant it, that I wanted whatever version of justice was actually still available after 11 years. That I understood I might never be able to prove what happened to my father in that final fatal week, but that I refused to let Tobias continue benefiting comfortably, indefinitely, from a fortune he'd stolen through fraud, that we absolutely could prove regardless of what we could or couldn't prove about the heart attack itself. And Farah nodded slowly and told me that was, in her professional opinion, the smart target, because financial fraud with documented evidence was something a prosecutor could actually build a case around, whereas an 11-year-old cardiac death with no contemporary forensic examination was realistically a door that had probably closed for good the moment his body was cremated, a detail that landed in my chest like a physical blow because I hadn't known, hadn't ever thought to ask why my father's funeral had been a cremation when every single person in our family going back 3 generations had always been buried. And when I finally asked my mother about it gently, carefully, during a quiet Sunday afternoon visit that I dressed up as simple curiosity about family history, her face did something complicated and pained before she told me that it had actually been Tobias's suggestion made during those first horrible, disoriented days after my father's death, framed as a way to save the family money during an already financially strained period, and my mother grieving exhausted, trusting the steady son-in-law who seemed to be the only person capable of making decisions, had simply agreed. and I sat there across from her, my own mother. Watching her innocently recount a detail that I now understood had almost certainly been a deliberate, calculated move to eliminate any possibility of future forensic examination, and something in me went very cold and very still in that moment. A feeling I can only describe as the specific, quiet fury of watching someone you love unknowingly confirm a horror you'd been desperately hoping wasn't true, and it was around this point in the investigation, roughly 7 months after I found that letter in the attic, that I made the decision to finally carefully bring my sister Chiamaka into what I now understood, but I did it slowly, deliberately, because I still genuinely did not know whether she'd been a knowing participant in any of this or an 11-year victim just as blind as the rest of us. And I chose a Saturday afternoon when Tobias was traveling for what he called a supplier conference meeting her, alone at a small cafe neither of us usually frequented, and I watched her face carefully as I laid out, piece by piece, gently, but without softening the actual substance of what Farah and I had uncovered, and what I saw in her reaction, the genuine, visceral shock, the way her hands started shaking around her coffee cup. The way she immediately, instinctively said, "That's not possible, he wouldn't." He loved Dad before catching herself and going very quiet, very pale, staring at documents I'd printed for her, convinced me as much as anything could convince me that whatever Tobias had done, he had done it entirely alone, that my sister had spent 11 years as unknowing and as deceived as the rest of us, married to a man capable of an entirely different kind of intimacy with the truth than the one he showed his family. And I want to tell you that this realization brought me some comfort. And in a strange way, it did, because it meant I wasn't fighting my own sister in this. But it also broke something in me freshly watching Chiamaka realize in real time that 11 years of her marriage, every anniversary, every quiet Sunday morning, every moment of genuine tenderness she believed she'd shared with her husband existed on top of a foundation of fraud and possibly murder that he'd never once even hinted at. And she asked me, her voice small, in a way I hadn't heard since we were children, what I wanted to do next, and I told her the truth, that I wanted to build a case airtight enough that Tobias couldn't buy charm or lawyer his way out of it, and that I needed her help doing it because she had something Farah and I didn't access. Years of accumulated trust inside a marriage that Tobias had no reason yet to suspect was crumbling, and I watched my sister grieving a marriage she hadn't yet officially lost. Make a decision in that cafe that I will respect for the rest of my life. She agreed to help not out of a desire for revenge, exactly, but because she told me, quietly staring at her cold coffee, she needed to know definitively what kind of man she'd actually spent 11 years loving, even if the answer destroyed her, and over the following 4 months, Chiamaka became an unwitting, careful source of information she'd never realized the significance of before mentioning in casual conversation, which accounts Tobias still personally managed rather than delegating to the company's newer accounting staff, noticing once she knew what to look for. Small inconsistencies in his behavior around certain vendor relationships, quietly photographing documents from his home office during ordinary days when he trusted her completely, never once suspecting that trust was being carefully, methodically weaponized against him. And Farah used this new stream of information to expand the financial trail dramatically, uncovering not just the original fraud that predated my father's death, but an ongoing, evolved version of the same scheme still active. Still bleeding money out of the company through increasingly sophisticated shell vendors. Money that we eventually calculated totaled well over $3 million across 11 years. Money that had funded a lifestyle Tobias had carefully calibrated to look comfortable, but not conspicuous. Nice cars, but not flashy ones. A beautiful, but not ostentatious home. Private school tuition for his and Chiamaka's 2 children, dressed up as generous grandparent gifts from a fictional inheritance on his side of the family that Farah discovered through simple genealogical research, didn't actually exist. And it was during this deep excavation of 11 years of careful theft that Farah found something that changed the entire shape of the case. Something buried in an old, dissolved shell company from the very early days of the scheme, a document listing a second signatory on one of the earliest fraudulent vendor accounts, a name that meant nothing to me when Farah first showed it to me. A woman named Patrice Boyd, and it took another 3 weeks of careful digging before we understood exactly who Patrice Boyd actually was, and when Farah finally sat me down and told me, I genuinely had to ask her to repeat herself because the sentence didn't make sense to me the first time I heard it. Patrice Boyd, it turned out, was Tobias's actual legal wife, married quietly 8 years before he ever met my sister, a marriage that had never been formally dissolved, meaning that for the entire 11 years, Tobias had been married to Chiamaka, presenting himself to our entire family, to courts, to banks, to everyone as a single available man before their wedding. He had in fact still been legally married to someone else. And I sat in Farah's office, staring at a marriage certificate from a small county courthouse, 3 states away, feeling something that wasn't quite shock anymore. Because by this point in the investigation, I'd absorbed so many layers of Tobias's deception that new revelations landed less like earthquakes and more like additional weight on a structure already collapsing. But this particular discovery meant something specific and legally significant. It meant that Chiamaka's marriage to Tobias had never been legally valid in the first place, that 11 years of shared property joint accounts and legal protections she believed she had as his wife had actually never existed. And when I told Chiamaka this final piece, sitting once more in that same quiet cafe, watching her absorb the news that her marriage had been not just built on fraud, but had literally never legally existed at all, I watched something shift in her that was different from shock or grief, something that looked unmistakably like clarity, like a woman finally understanding with complete, unclouded certainty exactly what kind of architecture her entire adult life had been built on. And she told me very calmly that she was done being careful, that she wanted to help me finish this properly, and together, over the next 2 months, we made the decision to bring everything, the original fraud, the ongoing fraud, the bigamy, and the deeply suspicious circumstances surrounding my father's death and cremation, to a prosecutor, choosing carefully at Farah's recommendation, an assistant district attorney named Renata Okonkwo Bell, who had a reputation for taking complex, long-buried financial crimes seriously rather than dismissing them as too old or too complicated to pursue. And the meeting we had with her, laying out 8 months of careful investigation across our conference table, was, in some ways, the moment I'd been building toward without fully realizing it, the moment where private grief and private suspicion finally became something with actual institutional weight behind it. And Renata Okonkwo Bell listened for nearly 3 hours without interrupting, occasionally asking sharp, precise questions that made it clear she was already building a mental framework for prosecution. And at the end of that meeting, she told us something that both relieved and terrified me in equal measure. She said the financial fraud case, backed by Farah's forensic documentation and Chiamaka's photographed records, was strong enough to move forward immediately, strong enough, likely, to result in serious prison time, even without ever touching the question of my father's death, but that the bigamy charge combined with the fraud gave them additional leverage, additional charges, additional pressure they could apply, and that regarding my father's death itself, she was honest with me in a way I appreciated, even though it hurt. She said that without an exhumation and forensic examination, which was legally possible but would require court approval and would be an enormously painful process for my mother, we would likely never have definitive proof of homicide. That 11 years and a cremation had made that particular door very difficult, though not entirely impossible to reopen, and she asked me directly whether I wanted to pursue that path, regardless of how difficult it would be. And I sat with that question for nearly 2 weeks, talking it through carefully with my mother, who, once I finally told her the full scope of what we'd discovered, reacted with a grief so profound and so quiet that it frightened me more than any anger could have. And my mother, this frail, grieving woman who had spent 11 years unknowingly sharing holiday dinners with the man who might have killed her husband, made the final decision herself. She told me she needed to know. That not knowing had already cost her 11 years of misplaced trust and grief directed at the wrong target, and that whatever pain came from finally learning the truth, however difficult, could not possibly be worse than the pain of continuing to live inside a lie. And so, alongside the fraud and bigamy charges that were already moving forward through the legal system, we petitioned the court for permission to review my father's original limited autopsy records, and working with a forensic pathologist, Renata Okonkwo-Bell, recommended an exhumation and full forensic re-examination was eventually approved. And I want to tell you honestly that the weeks leading up to that exhumation were the hardest of the entire process, harder even than the original discovery in the attic. Because hope and dread occupied the exact same space in my chest during that waiting period, and when the forensic pathologist's report finally came back 6 weeks later, it delivered a truth that was simultaneously a relief and a fresh wound. The report found clear, definitive evidence of a specific, undetected cardiac toxin, one that mimics the signs of a natural heart attack almost perfectly, unless a pathologist knows specifically to look for it. A toxin that, as it turned out, has a very limited number of legitimate industrial and medical uses. One of which Farah discovered through her continued research was as an ingredient in a specific pest control product that Tobias's original dissolved company from before his marriage to Chiamaka had, according to old employment records, occasionally handled during his brief and quietly terminated tenure there and standing in Renata Okonkwo Bell's office holding that forensic report. I finally, after 11 years, had something that felt less like a suspicion and more like the truth. Cold confirmed. And undeniable, my father had been murdered deliberately, methodically by a man who then spent the next 11 years sitting at our family table, eating our food, raising his voice gently over Christmas dinners, calling my father the man who taught me everything I know. And something in me hearing that confirmed truth out loud in a prosecutor's office didn't erupt into the violent rage I might have expected from myself years earlier. It settled instead into something colder, more focused, more patient, the exact quality I realized, with a strange, bitter irony that Tobias himself had spent 11 years mastering. And I understood in that moment that whatever came next needed to be pursued with exactly that same cold, methodical patience, not out of any desire to become like him, but because that was the only approach precise enough to guarantee he never walked away from what he'd done, and the arrest, when it finally happened, came on an ordinary Wednesday morning. 2 detectives and Renata Okonkwo-Bell, herself arriving at Tobias's office with an arrest warrant covering fraud, bigamy, and now following the forensic pathology report, an additional charge that had not existed in this case 8 months earlier, murder. And I wasn't there for the arrest itself. I'd specifically asked not to be. But Chiamaka called me 40 minutes later, her voice shaking, describing how Tobias's careful, controlled composure, the same composure that had fooled our entire family for 11 years, finally cracked completely the moment detectives read the specific charges aloud, how he'd looked directly at her, not at the detectives, and said only, "I did it for us, for our family. I never meant for it to go this far." A confession disguised as an excuse that told us finally, definitively everything we needed to know. In the trial that followed, it took nearly 14 months to reach its conclusion. 14 months of forensic testimony, financial documentation stretched across courtroom screens, expert witnesses explaining toxicology reports in careful, clinical language that somehow made the horror of what happened to my father feel simultaneously more real and more surreal. And throughout all of it, Tobias maintained a strange, unsettling calm, the same practiced composure he'd used for over a decade, right up until closing arguments, when the weight of 11 years of documented fraud, an undissolved prior marriage, and a forensic toxicology report that left almost no room for reasonable doubt, finally became too much even for his careful control. And I watched sitting in the gallery beside my mother and Chiamaka, as the jury returned a verdict of guilty on every count after only 6 hours of deliberation, guilty of fraud, guilty of bigamy, and guilty of second-degree murder, a verdict that came with a sentence of 32 years, a number that will keep him incarcerated well past his 70th birthday. And I want to tell you that hearing that verdict felt like triumph, like the clean, satisfying justice I'd spent nearly 2 years chasing. But the truth is more complicated than that. It felt like relief, enormous, exhausted relief. But underneath it sat a grief that no verdict could fully resolve, because no prison sentence, however long, actually returns 11 stolen years. or a father who never got to see his grandchildren, or the version of my sister's life that could have existed if she'd never met a man capable of what Tobias turned out to be capable of. And in the months following the trial, our family rebuilt itself slowly, imperfectly, the way real families actually do after devastation, rather than the neat, cinematic way stories sometimes suggest my mother. Freed finally from 11 years of unknowingly grieving beside her husband's killer, found a strange, hard-won peace, spending her days now surrounded by old photographs she could finally look at without the specific silent poison of misplaced trust clouding every memory. Chiamaka, once the legal proceedings around her never valid marriage were fully untangled, slowly began rebuilding a life defined entirely by her own choices rather than a decade of careful manipulation. Going back to school for the nursing career she'd abandoned years earlier when Tobias convinced her, gently, persistently, that staying home was better for their family, and I, Desmond Okafor, spent the money we eventually recovered through civil proceedings. A fraction of what was originally stolen, but enough to matter not on anything extravagant, but on rebuilding the family construction business my father spent 30 years creating, now run properly transparently. With Ferris Forensic Accounting Firm handling the books permanently, and Priscilla Adeyemi, the forensic accountant my father hired 11 years ago, and whose forgotten report sat waiting in a drawer for over a decade, brought on as a permanent consultant. A small, deliberate way of honoring the woman who tried to warn us and been ignored by circumstances entirely beyond her control. And sometimes late at night, I still think about that dusty attic, that single unsent letter. And how easily this entire truth could have stayed buried forever if my mother hadn't needed help with boxes during a hip replacement recovery. How close we came to letting Tobias finish out his life, comfortably undetected. Having successfully stolen not just a fortune, but 11 additional years of unearned trust and family intimacy on top of the life he originally took. And I've learned through all of this that justice delayed by 11 years is still justice, that patience, real patience, the kind built on careful evidence rather than rage, is often the sharpest weapon available to people who've been wronged. And that the people who hurt us most aren't always strangers lurking in shadows. Sometimes they're sitting across the table from us at every holiday dinner, smiling, passing the gravy, calling us brother. And the only real defense against that specific, intimate kind of betrayal is the same thing that eventually exposed it: a refusal to stop asking questions just because the answers might destroy the comfortable version of the story you'd rather keep believing.